and make it happen.
So this is Alan B. Smith with Jennifer Stein, director of Travis, the documentary. And we're just going to do a few questions here about debunking and get Jennifer's take on some of the more classical cases that we may or may not be aware of and more poignant cases that she thinks are important. So, hey, Jennifer.
Hi. Thanks, Alan, for having me on. It's
absolutely.
Such a pleasure.
Yeah. So take it away. You know, whatever you think is important, let us know. We'll just join it with the discussion.
Yeah, I thought it was really brilliant of you to consider, doing a show like this, because the general public doesn't really, it's still something that's under the radar. People have to be trained to recognize and identify the tactics of debunking. And I really learned a lot about it from doing the Travis documentary. I had the great pleasure of working with, I think, two guests you're going to have, Stanton Friedman. I think maybe you may be having Kathy Martin on too. I'm not sure. Are you having Kathy Martin?
Kathy Martin, Peter Robbins, and Mike Rogers. They'll all be listening to this. So.
Well, and they were all co-producers with me, really, Stanton Friedman and Peter Robbins especially. And I got to do research with Kathy at the American Philosophical Society. And she said, they have a whole file there in Philadelphia on Philip Klass. And she wanted to go research this file. So I got to spend time with her and go and read these long letters that Philip Klass wrote back and forth with Mike Rogers, who I also understand you're going to have on the show. So Mike Rogers is really a hero in my mind after reading literally a stack, like this of correspondence over probably 20 years that Philip had with Mike. Mike continued to try to answer his questions and write him, and Philip would always take things out of context, change things, never paid attention to the facts, would do bait and switch, would record the telephone calls, and then edit them, deleting certain things that Mike said, and then play them back and use them as evidence of actual conversations and rewrite conversations that didn't really happen in the order that they had, trying to make Mike look like a liar or like Mike was confused. And Mike had the patience of a saint. Anyone just sitting there reading these letters, you get so frustrated, you want to throw them across the room and go, man, he just doesn't get it. Like, when Philip Klass got an idea in his mind, he stuck to the point of trying to prove that idea, whether it made sense or not. And usually his ideas did not make sense.
Which is the opposite of the scientific method. The scientific method is actually to disprove your theory. That's your modus operandi. When with him, it's, nope, here's my hypothesis, and I'm going to prove it no matter what.
Now, what's really interesting is that he actually had a fairly, elaborate educational background. I think he studied electronics, or he was an engineer. He actually worked for General Electric for at least 10 years before he moved to Washington, D.C. and got a job as a writer with Aviation Weekly. And he was one of the first people to actually write about the electronic missile-guided systems. And how we were putting electronics in the tops of missiles to guide them with algorithms of topography. That's how they worked. And he knew a lot about that, and he actually wrote about that. I think once he was even accused by the FBI of actually releasing stuff that he shouldn't have released in a Aviation Weekly, news publication to the general public. So he was a very bright guy, and he knew how to use scientific jargon. And he would try to confuse people, and even confuse people he attacked sometimes as well, using his background.
Sure.
So he was very smart at how he did it. And I think he caught the attention of some people who really wanted debunking to happen. When Kathy and I went into the archives, and then again when I got the pleasure of going back there with Stanton and Kathy and reading a bunch of correspondence they were looking for. I was a reader, and I helped them, and I tagged things that I thought was important. But you could clearly see that he was communicating with people that we now know were involved in the NSA, like the head of the astronomy department at Harvard University, um, Donald Menzel. There were many letters back and forth in communication, and on a very friendly basis, and other, top important people in the government. And there were communications like, I'll see you next week on the yacht in Nice kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, or you suspect, or I suspected from reading these letters, that there was some quid pro quo possibly going on back and forth, where he was awarded certain trips, or was invited to certain places to stay for free in exchange for possibly his willingness to try to write intelligently in a debunking way. Because before Philip Klass was on the scene, Donald Menzel was a leading debunker of the whole UFO theory.
Didn't Donald Menzel kind of evolve a little bit, though, in that regard? Didn't he come off more objective earlier in his career?
Well, even, you saw a change certainly with, what am I thinking, J. Allen Hynek.
Sure.
You're thinking of J. Allen Hynek. Like, he was this atmospheric physicist and scientist at Northwestern, mm-hmm. who was hired to kind of head up the Blue Book project when they finally decided they wanted someone outside the government and outside the military to head it up. But he was literally told he was supposed to try to, debunk these things.
But he wasn't in his heart a debunker. He was sort of following orders.
Right, he was following orders, and probably, but around the end of his life, he was really convinced that something serious was going on, and there needed to be serious attention to it.
Right. Well, I mean, why wouldn't Philip Klass think that something serious is going on, or did he? And he just continued debunking. And then what's the point? Why continue debunking like that? What was his motive?
Well, those are really good questions. What was his motive? It's hard to know. You would think, as a writer for Aviation, Weekly, that he would be curious and want to get to the bottom of it, but he never really seemed to look at the facts. He would always come up with these ideas. Like, one of his ideas early on, he kind of got known as a debunker probably around the mid-'60s, when that very famous film came out, Incident at Exeter. There was this book John F. Fuller wrote, mm-hmm. and Klass immediately attacked that book and Fuller. And he said that UFO sightings, like in this New England area, all happened around power lines, and that there was probably some kind of plasma discharge happening from the power lines. But he had no evidence to back that up. It was just this theory that he came up with. Sure, and he was attacked a lot of times by a lot of superiors, and engineers and electrical engineers. And they would say, that's absurd. Of course, everything's insulated and you're not going to have plasmas. And why would you have a plasma happen once when there was a UFO sighting and then not again the next week? If there were those dangerous things happening with our electrical power lines, then we're in big trouble, because they're all over the country, right? Mm-hmm. The transformers and things that are up aren't giving off electrical plasma discharges. And he finally, like by the end of the 60s, dropped that theory. Yeah. But that's how Klass would operate.
Well, it's almost like swamp gas.
I suspect there had to be a motive, but what was the motive, right, we still don't know. He may have been found out. There might be something in his unique past. He remained single till very late in life. He only married, I think, in his late 60s, and he married a woman 20 years younger than him. But most of his life he was single. He could go to conferences all the time, which he did, and then he would report back on these conferences. And he actually started a number of other organizations to kind of debunk the UFO organization. He let me see if I can find it in my notes. He started like a skeptical society, an aviation skeptical society. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's called the Committee for the Scientific Investigation of Claims of Paranormal. It's CSICOP, PsyCop.
Yes.
And
okay.
Then he actually started a whole nother publication too, to just write about debunking things. It was called Skeptic UFO Newsletter that he started writing. Mm-hmm. So how did he get the money to create whole new publications? And then there's obviously some someone who was probably giving him money, because it's very famously noted in the Travis Walton case that he offered the youngest crew member, Steve Pierce, a $10,000 bribe for Steve to come forward and claim that the UFO story in the woods was all made up, and that it was really a hoax. And it was a hoax for some motive of Mike Rogers and the other members of the crew to possibly scam the Forest Service and get paid for not doing a job because they were frightened by this UFO.
Right.
It was an absurd idea. It didn't align with the facts.
Well, no, go ahead.
Yeah, so where did he get the money to come up with a bribe? And in order to deliver the bribe, he flew a couple times once to Arizona and I think once to Texas, tracked Steve down even though he was operating under another name. He started using his middle name named Jeff because he was trying to hide from all the criticism and attacks he was getting. And all these boys underwent huge amount of social ridicule. Many of it, or most of it was stimulated by articles and things that Philip Klass wrote or spoke about on radio shows and television shows. So where did he get the money for those trips? Why would he be so hell-bent on getting the youngest member of the crew to maybe change his story? And I think the only reason he went after Steve was maybe a little more it was possible maybe he could manipulate Steve. Steve was young. He could have used the money. And I think Steve didn't give him a definite no the first couple times they discussed it. So he thought, well, if I show up in person with money in my hand, I'll get him. And
but that's like taking a criminal or a suspected criminal into custody and then offering them money to confess to
exactly.
something. I mean, how did any journalist abide by any of this? I mean, that's what's even more difficult to understand. Like, how can someone not just call Philip Klass out and be like, hey, this is really messed up. But he continued to operate like that. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you can get away with that now.
Right.
Yes,
there's where we have information at our fingertips and we can dig and find things much more quickly. And, Philip was a person who was in a very high prestigious place. If there was a television show like Larry King Live, right, or something, CNN or NBC News or whatever, he could get himself on a show, no problem, as a skeptic. Why? Why was he singled out more than, say, someone like James McDonald, who was an atmospheric physicist, at University of Arizona, and openly spoke about the fact that we needed to look at UFOs. There was a big tussle that went on for years between James McDonald and Philip Klass as well. So there are a lot of questions that come up when you start to really read and look into Philip's past, like why, what did he operate the way that he did? What was his motivation? Maybe he had a transgression and he was forced into this type of a job. It's sometimes suspected by, I've heard many, UFO people, suggest that.
You kind of get the feeling of a deal with the devil with him.
Yes, and that's a very good line, because he would constantly make bets with people. He would say,
Stanton, right? Like,
you're full of crap. That's right. You'll get Stanton to talk about that. It's very famous. Stanton won the bet actually published, the check that that Philip had to write him, and then Philip was furious with him that he did that, and Stanton said, "Hey, look, I won the bet. There was no agreement between us that I couldn't publish your check. Right. I still cashed it. I just made a Xerox of it. There's nothing illegal in making a Xerox of a check. Yeah. I'm not trying to cash it twice. I've done nothing illegal." So, it's just, it's really, really fascinating. The more you dig, the more you find when you look at Philip.
Well, what about modern day debunking? I mean, are there any figures that stand out to you?
Well, I hate to call out people, but I suspect someone like Neil deGrasse Tyson goes around, does these fabulous astronomical programs, has a television show and whatnot. But if you ask him point blank on a radio show or something about what's the likelihood now of, us encountering extraterrestrial life, right? He laughs it off and says it's impossible to get here. I mean, he
Right,
still
right.
is quoting details and facts that are probably not real relevant now that what we
Hmm.
know about life inhabiting planets is in the
Yeah.
billions, and certainly within our solar system, there may be more, it's possible, right?
Yeah.
We're doing a manned mission to Mars, right? Maybe to build a structure there,
Hmm.
maybe for mining, maybe for minerals, maybe for exploration, or maybe as a hopping off or jumping off point. We're looking for water there. So
Right.
if we're at that point in our own evolution, it's very egocentric to think that some other population, some other species didn't evolve 2, 3 million years before we did.
Right.
And if they did, obviously they'd be much further advanced than us. So it's almost an old argument at this point. You're almost like an ostrich with your head in the sand if you claim that it's
For
totally impossible.
Yeah, like you said, it's a good point. It's like he's using physics theories
Right,
of Carl Sagan's era, and he studied under Carl Sagan.
right, right,
Um, but the Alcubierre drive, Dr. Alcubierre, a Mexican physicist, came up with the idea of a warp drive and made it theoretically possible within the physics that we knew. But then it was like, oh, it would just take so much mass and energy to create so much mass and such a giant ship to create the energy that you need for this thing. And then other physicists came along in the early 2000s, like, wait a minute, we tweaked the calculation. We might be able to do this to the point that NASA has a subdivision where they're actually researching this.
yes,
So why does he completely ignore that fact in his when he's debunking, essentially, I
right,
guess, when he's saying like, oh, they can't possibly reach us. At the same time, he's promoting the idea that this universe is filled with life and that it's
right.
everywhere. So it's like, okay,
Right.
so
Right, right.
those things
See,
just
that's
don't.
kind of the bait and switch
Yeah,
that
yeah.
that
Hmm.
debunkers sort of do.
I wouldn't say he's a mean
And
debunker. He's not like Philip Klass. You know what I mean? He's not like
right,
trying to
he's not
cut your throat.
attacking direct people.
Right,
He's
exactly.
not writing a weekly magazine and going after authors and scientists and things like that. Although he
Hmm.
probably had some critical things to say about Avi Loeb. He's the current Harvard head of astronomy at Harvard.
Yeah, a
And
lot of people
he's
did.
the one who commented, as of course, on Oumuamua, which
Hmm.
was very interesting. I mean, I think if the general public really reads like just even the New York Times and the Washington Post, if you just look at, say, the stories of Elizondo that came out, Luis Elizondo in December of 2017,
Hmm.
and then you look at the November story, the year later, 2018, of this Oumuamua, is it an asteroid? Probably not. Asteroids
Yeah.
don't come in at one speed, then turn, and then take off at another speed at 4 or 5 times the speed, right?
It
Uh,
defies physics. They can't explain it.
yes,
And so he's offering a possible theory. I mean,
right,
there's nothing wrong with that because
right.
regular physics just doesn't explain it away. So
Account,
you have to look for alternatives. I think
right,
that's fair. That's science. That's what you do.
right. So
There's,
Neil
yeah,
deGrasse Tyson
yeah,
said, absolutely not. He doesn't know what he's talking about. It's absurd. It can't be true. It can't be real.
yeah.
So that makes me suspect, I've been to programs that he's done, and in a large auditorium, I didn't stand up and ask a UFO question, but there were
Hmm.
some from the audience, and he rebuffed them. So the
Yeah.
typical approach of making someone look silly or stupid, or you try to attack the character of a person.
Yeah.
You don't necessarily pay attention to the facts. I mean, Stanton will go over that very quickly with you.
Hmm.
He's got it like on 5 fingers, the typical things debunkers do.
Exactly.
But Philip was that, and I think if you dig, you'll find some current ones as well. I'm probably not an expert on who the current debunkers are, but I will tell you that, and I know we don't have that much time, but for your program,
Hmm.
I tried to do a decent job in my documentary, spending at least 10 minutes talking about Philip
You
Klass.
did. Yeah.
And many people who know about the Travis Walton story really don't know about the Philip Klass details. And if they're really interested in why Travis's story still remains or is still considered alleged by some people.
Mm-hmm.
It's because of the actions and activity that Philip undertook for a good 20 to 25 years. He hounded these boys and attacked their character again and again and again. Like, I think he thought the Travis Walton story would go away. And then when Paramount Pictures decided to do the movie, right, that's when suddenly they're on Larry King Live. And then, Philip has to jump up there and get involved and attack them and the story all over again because it's going to be in people's minds.
Yeah.
So he did. So I think it's important for anyone who wants to understand how Philip operated to, if they watch that film, pay attention to this 10 minutes that occurs right around 1 hour. You're into the middle of the film and we start digging deeper and deeper and deeper. And some people have really criticized me for that because I go off topic of Travis. But really, my point in sharing this with you, and of course in making the film, is that to really understand what Travis lived through, you have to have this 40-year perspective, right? It's not a single little story. It's a series of stories that kind of go round the clock in his life, where he has to deal with this again and again and again and again and again. And then you have to understand the type of person Philip was and who the other people were that he also attacked. Right? He went after the head of University of Arizona's astronomy department. I'm blanking on his name at the moment. It'll come to me. Judge McDonald.
James
McDonald.
Okay.
And of course, Alan Hynek. He went after Alan Hynek from time to time when Hynek, fell out of step with his job. Right. He went after a lot of different people in his life. Anybody who wrote a UFO book. In fact, Kathy can share some interesting stories with you about how he tried to buy the tapes from Dr. Simon of the regressions that were done on her aunt and uncle, Betty and Barney Hill. And he probably was trying to buy the tapes to change them, distort them, destroy them. We don't really know. But
if he was going to buy an original copy, then he can control the narrative.
Exactly.
However,
that's what he was after.
But the whole thing was a mess in the first place because Benny and Barney Hill wanted to keep everything private.
Right.
And so there was Webster from NICAP. I forget what his first name, but he was their contact, right? Was it Webster?
Right.
Webster?
Right. Yeah, I think it was maybe Bill.
Bill Webster? Or Bill Webb, maybe?
I'm not sure.
The name's slipping me. But yeah, NICAP, that was their one contact that they trusted. They trusted Dr. Simon. Pierce Air Force Base nearby. They had contacts there that they reported. And this was all kept under wraps until a journalist, I think his last name was Lars. It's a little slippery in my mind right now. But broke the story, and it turned out that a friend of Betty's had sold them out, and the journalist got information from NICAP nefariously. Though this person lied, and so everything came out. And I think for someone like Philip Klass, it's a good time to go in and try to take advantage. Everything's kind of chaotic for Betty and Barney Hill. They weren't in control of their own narrative at that point, so it would have been perfect for him to step in and try to change the direction of the story.
Right. For debunking, it's really interesting. You don't really need to prove anything. All you need to do is cast doubt. And once you've cast doubt, you're sort of dividing the information stream, and then you're getting people arguing with each other, and then the listening public gets lost in the argument and they lose track of the original story. They can't follow all the facts being thrown back and forth at each other. So you create confusion. It's actually sort of the tactic of a terrorist as well. You throw a bomb, create confusion, claim someone's wronged you. And then before you know it, it's a he said, she said. It gets very confused. It's the typical typical tactics of someone who's a debunker, and you saw it again and again and again.
Well, what about you? Has anyone come after you since doing the documentary?
Not really. There are occasionally some, anti-Semitic comments that come up on Facebook, maybe because I'm Jewish. Occasionally, I come across, people at a conference that show up and claim that it was already proven that, Travis lied. I think Philip set up a television interview in somewhere in New Mexico where he went on some television show with some of the other guys actually as well. And he was supposed to take a lie detector test on television and prove once and for all if he was telling the truth. And if he passed it, he would get $1 million. Well, Travis had already taken 5 or 6 lie detection tests.
Seriously?
Right? Really seriously. And of course, it was set up, and they made him look like he failed so that everyone wouldn't think that the story was fake, and Philip could refer to it all the time. And there was another interesting case with the boys from the logging crew. They challenged Klass because Klass would always set up bargains with people, right? He'd always say, "Oh, I'll bet you $10,000 this or $10,000 that." So he set up a challenge for the boys that if they took another lie detection test and passed, he would pay them a certain amount of money. And they agreed and said, we'll agree on these terms. And the terms are that it has to be a professional lie detection person, not like the scam you set Travis up with on the television show. Yeah. We have to equally agree on their background and, their credentials to be reliable. And if we lose, we'll pay you, but if you lose, you have to pay us. And he actually ended up never fully following through with that agreement, even though the boys were willing to do it and found a polygraph person, agreed to, schedule the tests and whatnot. But Philip was supposed to pay for the tests, but he never came through.
Yeah, he didn't want to have to write another check. So.
Right.
Yeah.
And he knew he couldn't control that other guy.
Mm-hmm.
So, but no, I don't get attacked. Sorry, I didn't really fully answer your last question. I'm sort of on the periphery. I'm not really a main UFO person where I'm writing books about the topic. Sure. I just decided that I was going to try to do a really good job in covering Travis's story because I thought it was an excellent example of the whole debunking story. How these stories really don't go away. And this story was, 7 loggers in the forest. One ends up going missing for 5 days. I mean, gosh, does that stuff really happen? Yes, it does, and it can. And I thought it really needed to be covered and covered well because the younger generations are not really reading. They're watching videos, they're watching movies, they get their information in sound bites.
So you're trying to get in there, get their eyes on the
I was
subject.
Trying to get their attention and say, look, it's been 40 years, and when he was 21, this is what happened to him. And, maybe their stories like this continue to go on, but they're not getting out there for one reason or another. Yeah. And I also wanted to kind of exonerate the boys, especially Travis, because he never really chose to come forward with his story. It's one of the things that people miss sometimes. In the complexity of the story, they don't understand that by the time he came back, he was already known in the news because it broke in the news as a homicide story, a missing person story, and a potential murder, right? So, newsrooms around the world were calling that Holbrook Sheriff's Department, and bugging the 2 key detectives who were trying to unravel the story. His name was Marlon Gillespie, was one of the sheriffs, and the other one was, it'll come to me in a minute, Deputy Ellison. And these guys phoned him at their home. They phoned him constantly at the office all day long. They could hardly get anything done, and news crews showed up all the time. So Travis was a household name, certainly, in the northeast corridor of Arizona because there was this manhunt on for him, but also around the world. Yeah. And he had to come forward because he was hounded, even though his older brother tried to protect him. And that was the other, motive for me to kind of really tell the story from the inside perspective, from Travis's perspective,
Right.
because a lot of people tell the story from the outside, but I was really trying to give people an understanding that, look, if Travis could go back and redo it and not get out of that truck,
Right.
he would, but you
And
never
also
have that hindsight.
You gave a chance for the other players to have their say in their
Exactly.
experience as well.
Right, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people don't, know them or have them in their minds, Steve Pierce.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of documentaries, especially television documentaries, don't necessarily give those guys a chance to tell the story from their point of view. Right.
That's right.
All right. Well, we should wrap it up because we're definitely over the original time.
We're over time. Yeah. We're over time.
But
so you'll cut and clip and see what works for you.
Yeah, but thank you so much for doing this.
Alan, it was such a pleasure. I wish you a lot of luck with the rest of the show. And please say hi to my dear friends. I'm really grateful, and I'm indebted to Peter and Kathy and, of course, Stanton for all of his assistance and help in the Travis Project.
Yeah,
so
they're great
send
people.
them my best. All right. Blessings to you.
Yeah,
Thank you
too.
so much.
Okay, thanks, Jennifer.
Bye.
Bye. If you like today's content, please like or subscribe below.
Janeway out.